Listening to that, excessive, perhaps, use of the word gentleman there from President Trump, Randy, very loaded use of the word. I mean, how do these kind of attacks from a president go down within the Fed? You're someone who knows the inner workings of the Fed. How much does it complicate the job when you see a president make these kind of very overt comments about Fed policy?
It certainly complicates the communications, but I really don't think it changes the fundamental policy that they've been pursuing. You could see last December, the Fed raised rates, even though the president on the day of the meeting was tweeting this would be a mistake. So the Fed clearly showed it was going to do what it thought was best. But it does really complicate the communication, because the Fed has to do what it thinks is right, but also has to make it clear that it is not doing just the bidding of a politician. And now sometimes what it wants to do is actually the same as what some of the political actors want to do. But you don't want to have that perception that they're just following that, because that would then lead to a loss of credibility and a loss of confidence in the Fed.
What do you think about raising rates just for the sake of building up your store of dry powder, Randy? I mean, we haven't really seen inflation. No one expects it in the U.S. or really globally. And yet the Fed has managed to raise rates. Well, this chart looks like 9 or 10 times since the end of 2015. Fortunately, actually, because in case of a downturn, we have that much to cut.
Well, it's funny, the Fed gets criticized on both sides. So it's like, well, there's no inflation, why are they raising rates? And on the other side is that they've had this crazy low interest rate policy. They've got to get out of it as quickly as possible. I think they've tried to balance those two, and they've gradually raised rates as the inflation rate has been about 1.5% to 2%, so a bit below its target. But it's been ahead of the inflation curve. I think that's one of the reasons why we see such flat yield curves, because expectations of future inflation are quite low, because the Fed has been ahead rather than behind. In the past, typically central banks, and particularly the Fed, waited until inflation got above 2%, and then they'd have to zoom rates up to try to break inflation expectations. Now they're doing it in advance. The U.S. economy grew very strongly last year, while the rest of the world was slowing. So I think it's hard to be too critical of Fed policy, at least so far.
Randy, where do you see the dollar heading? We heard President Trump talking about it there. I've got a chart here that identifies a number of episodes in the past year or two where President Trump has talked about the strength of the dollar, complained about it, and it hasn't necessarily brought the dollar down, although hard to prove the counterfactual, I suppose, but it hasn't necessarily weighed on the currency. Would you expect these kind of comments from a president to negatively impact the currency or not?
So first, I don't think that Jay Powell has a particular view of where the dollar should be. I think he thinks the market should be determining the dollar. He understands the implications of U.S. interest rate policy relative to ECB policy or Bank of England policy, and of course that has an impact on the dollar. But he doesn't have a particular view of where it should be, and there are a lot of factors that are outside of the U.S. that also have an impact on the dollar. So I think that's why, regardless of what one politician says, it's hard for that to really drive the value of the U.S. dollar.
So we had one guest on earlier saying that the dollar is, to Trump's point, is too strong, is overvalued. Would you share that view?
I think it's very hard to know exactly when a currency is overvalued or undervalued if it's largely market determined. If there's an intervention by a country like China or others, then you can easily make that statement. The markets are determining what the value is. It's really just relative to expectations about what the ECB is going to do, Bank of Japan, Bank of England.
A lot of critics will say, and have been saying really for years and years, Randy, that the dollar will eventually lose some of its strength as a world reserve currency, but it doesn't seem to have happened yet. Is that on the horizon?
I don't see that on the horizon, because the currency market is always a relative market. It's always got to be why the dollar relative to something else, because you have to choose some currency to hold your assets in. And the euro was a challenge for a while, but obviously with the challenges within the eurozone and questions about the euro, that's not a challenge. People thought the renminbi could rise up, but I think given all the opacity in the institutions in China, that's not going to be a challenge. And there's really nothing else. So eventually there may be something, but at least in the near to intermediate term, I really can't see anything challenging the dollar.